by something like a metonymy of the will Zermach, the will to power. According to Kafka, we have something which in the fabulous world of daily correctness we regard as the law and a legal system. Agamben points out that in Israel this isn't so. There's a house of judgment. There's not a house of justice, and that this is in the language. How so far is the lex talionis ever genuinely superseded by the Hindu and the Greek thinkers? So I customarily draw the beginning for the Athenians in the time of Pisistratus. Pisistratus was probably the model for the philosopher king. He was actually a straight-out tyrant, probably, I suppose, a bit like the Venetian princes, because he did things which pleased the population, such as having parades where figures, mythical figures, were standing tall in the parade, and goddesses and so on, pulled along by some impressive ox cart or something. And the same things that Modi does today in the countryside, Hindu countryside, Pisistratus did in Athens in 600 BC. And then he had the Iliad and Odyssey committed to scrolls. And he did things of public benefice, let's say, in general. From this time onward, we have the lex talionis, is the law of retaliation or vendetta, is cast into disrepute, and sort of, it's a blub, it goes under, but it still remains in the so-called, now in the theory of the unconscious. And this was associated with Thebes, but Thebes had once been a great ally of Athens, and therefore the split was all the more brutal, as in the various plays that show the as such as the Antigone, that show the brutality of the these horrible Thebans who have no sense of the law proper, but only the sense of the law of retaliation or vendetta, of sort of a mafia situation. So what's the point of all this? The point is, how much is philosophy, how much is thinking grown up in the direct power of this moral question of mens rea, which comes in the Latini tradition, the Roman tradition, Romanish tradition, to become Romanish understood as a third of the Europeans, alongside the Slavs and alongside the Teutonics, which include also the English. Totally different, of course, from the result we get from a DNA test. DNA test gives you something totally different, because we're not talking here about the material. We're not talking about the biological being. We're talking here about the being, the actual being, who you actually are. Like one day you wake up and you're like, you realize you're yourself and you have responsibility for yourself. Up until then, you were just material. So, but usually by the time you'll come aware of this, of being yourself, you'll have already, been through, you already know many things, such as how to read and write and so on, because you'll have been trained as material in a certain sense. It's true, you already in a way have had your individuality and been proficient and have learned many things that you'll carry on for the rest of your life that are unique to yourself, because you'll have had a sort of what do you say? Some people are more mechanically inclined, and it shows already when they're maybe even 3 or 4 years old. It doesn't require them to be consciously aware of it. They're just open to that. They're responsive. They're responsive to the mechanical things. Okay, just as others are responsive to the visual things in a certain way, and therefore become visual artists. So we have a certain question that philosophy in its origins is questionable. It arises in a certain legal framework. Is this the ultimate framework? Can we step out of this framework? I think questions like this, it's interesting to look at this Deneen Muñoz debate on whether Strauss is worthy of continuing in the academy, or whether he should be excised, as once was Socrates. Shows some of the fine details of how this type of question must come into a legal matrix, must eventually reach all these matrices, but should it, however, remain free? So Muñoz is saying there's this problem about Strauss, because Strauss thinks, according to a few chapters in Natural Right and History, he says that Hobbes has influenced the American founders. So Muñoz doesn't understand the point Strauss is making. The point Strauss is making is that in Hobbes, it doesn't matter if Hobbes as a particular individual exists, okay, but it doesn't matter if the founders specifically read Hobbes. Some of them did, but if they specifically said, I agree with Hobbes and we're doing a Hobbesian thing, that doesn't matter. I'm not saying Muñoz nor Deneen can't understand this. Of course they can, but whether they've applied it at every moment of their thinking is another question. But the point is, the real point here is Muñoz has misunderstood how Strauss understands Hobbes. So Strauss doesn't understand Hobbes as he thinks. What he thinks is there's a cardinal distinction between whether, as Deneen says, you're sort of locked into the true, you're due to be at liberty rather than to be at license, is to follow in some way the knowledge of the true and the good, or something along those lines, the highest principles, however they may be understood, something like that. Whereas supposedly, according to Hobbes, no, this all goes out, everyone's equal because of the social contract, and then you got a totally different notion of liberty. Liberty is wide open. No, that's not how Strauss understands Hobbes at all. Strauss understands Hobbes as sort of almost the same as Aquinas, but sort of just setting the bar lower. So he says, okay, we really want the same thing as Aquinas wanted, but since the nature of things is like this, we can only hope that the state will provide us with some low things, and some amongst them that we won't be murdered. And if the state itself tries to murder us, then the deal is off. So that's how Strauss understands Hobbes, is sort of saying within, basically as Aquinas, but with a big, huge discount, because he thinks the nature of things is so bad, and maybe because he lived during the Civil War period, would have to flee from his homeland and so on. During the time of Cromwell and so on. But the point is that the Muñoz view is sort of like saying, there's this big difference between whether we say there could be an aristocracy of human beings, or whether everyone is equal in a different sense. So then he throws in another sense, which also isn't the Hobbesian sense, and maybe the obsession of Hobbes is more on the Deneen side. It's a subtle discussion, but basically what he concludes is that Strauss hasn't understood this or that, etc., etc. So I suppose one has to say, one can reverse that and say he hasn't understood the point that Strauss is making, which is that Hobbes is like a lower bar on this. So Hobbes isn't... but this doesn't address Muñoz chiefly. Let's go more to what addresses Muñoz. I think what addresses Muñoz's point about is there an genuine aristocracy in nature, or can one say everyone is in a way a root that keeps the whole social being going? What's the point in terms of his adducing Plato and saying, so Muñoz is saying Socrates wants to be fed at the Piastrium, or at the public dole. He wants to be like a university professor who one says about this university professor, can we spare one man to investigate this bullshit? It's total nonsense. Well, okay, we'll feed him in the Piastrium, or wherever Socrates requested to be fed, along with the rest of the public officials in the Apology according to Plato. Not sure it would be a question whether this is repeated also in the other version of the Apology. But in any case, I don't see... So I guess this is not in itself what he's really getting at. What he's getting at is sort of, what's the sort of glass bead game, Hermann Hesse thing, that we should understand as the place where the academy is. Is it in another world? Is it I think in a way he's just kicking against the pricks of this, saying the academy is the ivory tower in which this eternal attitude maintains. But the eternal attitude is exactly defined principles such as, for instance, I say there are many principles. And this is just a statement. It's just language. And in a certain way, it doesn't make sense to try to say it's an empirical question. Or another would be to say there's a kind of truth which is just, I guess the Kantian way, right? So the Kantian way is that there's these analytic truths that were true, and they're already true in themselves. They don't have to be tested empirically, right? That's another way of saying it. I don't think it's not at all obvious to exhaust these type of things by just saying there's three positions, and there's the ones that are true without being tested, like rules, like the rules of chess. There's others where you have to test them, like looking in the cupboard. And then there's a third uncertain category. I think it's more complicated than that. It's infinitely more complicated than that. But I think the Muñoz problem here is he's simply in trying to he doesn't give Strauss, he doesn't really, it's as though to say just to break away from Strauss he would deny Strauss, but he doesn't really give Strauss the full credit. Maybe Strauss is simply right about this, and actually he does seem to be, so far as just because Strauss is right doesn't mean one has to be an iconoclast in order to be a free thinker. There could be also the Deneen sense that to think like Strauss is to think along with the truth, but then we of course have to follow Heidegger and Heidegger's analysis of truth, especially in the book on logic and psychologism. What is truth? Is truth a Sprachspiel? Could we be told what truth is better by Wittgenstein than by the scholastics? Is there some mysterious lake of Nemi where no ripple defaces the waters, where we could present ourselves humbly to ask these terrible questions?